Okay, hi. So it's been a minute, but we're going to talk today about some nonfiction that I've been reading lately. I did a video at the beginning of the year to talk about a project that I'm doing in 2025, which is to read books from Africa. And that's nonfiction about Africa, and it's, authors from Africa, and I'm trying to read different times, different genres, etc. But I really started off the year being in a mood to read nonfiction, so that's what this video is going to be about, the 4 nonfictions that I've read so far. They've been a little focused on different areas of Africa. As I've read different books, I've wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the histories that I've read about, so we'll just get started. Okay, so the first book that I want to talk about is Fever, Feuds, and Diamonds, Ebola and the Ravages of History by Paul Farmer. Paul Farmer is an American doctor who has done a lot of more humanitarian type work through his career, doing work through different parts of the world, generally speaking, places that don't have as readily available access to modern medicine, and maybe not even modern hospitals. He's done a lot of work in this field, has set up a lot of great things around the world, and passed away pretty recently. This book is about his experience, in part, of him being in Sierra Leone during the massive Ebola breakouts that occurred in 2014. So this book is broken up into 3 parts. Part 1 is really about that. It's about his experience there, talking through trying to set up organizations and get funding to be able to go into these areas to help people who were dying at very rapid rates, talking about the difference in treatment between individuals who are Sierra Leonean and contracted Ebola versus the individuals that from other countries that came in. So a lot of those people who contracted it were able to be evacuated, and those evacuations led to the recovery of most of those individuals. And the even in the health working sector, people not being saved. So a lot of healthcare workers from Sierra Leone died during this time. Some very famous in the area doctors that were they really don't have many doctors there. I think that was it this book that I read that compared it to it would be like having 12 doctors or something in Boston, all of Boston. I could have the numbers wrong, but you get the kind of impression that it sets. And he also talks in that first part about the way in which the response occurred and how culture was not taken into account. So when they said quarantine, when they said don't wash the bodies of your dead because you can contract it, it really wasn't done in such a way that was culturally sensitive, so people went against these things because it's a part of the culture to cleanse the dead and do these other practices of taking care of people. The challenging responses to being able to set up the hospitals and stuff, part 1 was very nice. It was my favorite part of the book. He also talked in that part about his experience, other people's stories who had been through this, who some of them had survived this, some of them were survived by their loved ones. Their experiences are kind of molded by the history of Sierra Leone, which dealt with civil war in the 90s. So then he kind of braces you for part 2 by saying, I was ignorant about what the goings on of Sierra Leone and the other surrounding countries. So I needed to teach myself, and that's what part 2 is, but he's also trying to teach you, and he's not a historian, and so for part 2 for me was long and challenging to read. He went through histories, different groups, different people, bouncing between Sierra Leone and Liberia, and it was really hard to tell why Liberia was consequential to the historical narrative. And he really just wasn't the right person to write that part of the book. So I did not find that one helpful. I didn't find that one helpful or super informative. There was a lot of facts, but the conveyance of the information wasn't that great. I think that it would have been so much better if he had instead really cut down to the root of what he wanted to say, which was the history of Sierra Leone is what caused their medical system and lack thereof to look the way it did, which was critical to the difficulties in establishing care in the Ebola crisis. This book also came out, like, he talks about it at the end, but it came out like right after, like, the WHO had been leading studies of different pharmaceuticals that could be used as treatments, and he didn't have a lot of positive things to say about that, which I found kind of interesting. Like, it was still happening while he was writing the book, but it felt like the story kind of ended a little too early to get that, like, yeah, and we found a treatment that we could bring in and help people with for future outbreaks. That was kind of missing from the narrative. But yeah, overall, I think that if I were to recommend this book, I would really just recommend you read part 1. I think you could skip to part 3 if you want and just totally skip part 2. If you don't have a history of Sierra Leone, part 3, you might have some questions, but part 2, he really wasn't the right author for that information. So then I decided to go down the path of saying, okay, well, I didn't think part 2 was the right place to get this information from, so where should I get it? And I decided to read Blood Diamonds by Cambell. And the fact that this was translated into a fictional story is just kind of bizarre to me. Yeah, that's a little bizarre, but that's anyway. So this one also wasn't that great of a win for me. This is a book about tracing the history of blood diamonds, trying to trace diamonds back to their source, and the war and the blood and, like, the civil war that kind of went into the trade of diamonds in different countries that were part of that diamond trade. This was published in 2002. This book didn't really jive with me. Cambell went to the country and he interviewed people, went to different sites. So he was getting, like, firsthand information, and I think that that's clear on the page. He presents the information, but he's definitely pretty insensitive with his writing style, with how he explains people. He also makes, like, a lot of, like, very sweeping statements, conclusions with literally nothing to back it up. Okay, so an example of that was when he said, no conflict diamonds. And, like, I'm going to speak about this book later, but Cobalt Red, which is about Cobalt, there's no civil war going on, but you can have conflict diamonds without civil war level conflict. He would just make very large generalizations like that. And then he was, an on-the-ground journalist watching things happen. And I put it into perspective that this was published in 2002 because he's an American, and he was in this area during 9/11. And he kind of connects it back to 9/11, speaking to the notion that bin Laden kind of gained money and laundered through the use of these diamonds. And so that's kind of how he connects it back to 9/11. But he would just say things like, I don't have the exact quote, but he's describing, like, disgusting atrocities, like people being killed for absolutely no reason, people losing limbs for no reason. He is going into gory detail of the deaths of these people. And then he has, like, the audacity to say, when he's talking about 9/11, that it's an unspeakable atrocity. And I'm like, sir, Sir, you are literally describing atrocities right now. You're speaking them. And then you want to say 9/11 is an unspeakable atrocity. And like, I'm not here to compare atrocities, but like, you're talking about children being killed. You're talking about child soldiers and like kids with like no like dead looks in their eyes, holding guns up at other people and literally murdering people before they're 10. You're talking about people's arms being chopped off for no other reason than it seems for people's entertainment. And then you're going to speak right all these atrocities and then call something else unspeakable. It's just like, I don't know, very like, when it's not in my backyard, it's not as atrocious. I don't know. That's the vibes I got. So I think that I got information. Like I'm going to talk about Cobalt Red because like I just think it was a better done version of this. He also talks about the actual diamond trade, the mining of diamonds occurring, the servitude kind of going into that, and the people in power in this conflict who are taking the diamonds and distributing them, and then they get distributed through dirty pathways, and there's really no way that once they get to the people who polish it and the final consumer, you'll ever know if you had a blood diamond that came from conflict areas or if you had a diamond that came from another part of the world that was more ethically sourced. You can't know. There's no way. And then it also talked about how the main corporation that in power through this had like full control over like the amount of money diamonds cost, the diamond market, and like the ways that they maintained control of that through time, and that they hoard diamonds essentially. So even, you know, if you were going to buy diamonds maybe now, I'm not sure because this book was published in 2002, so we're talking 23 years later, there might be a slew of diamonds that they still have in inventory that were from this time era, and there's just no way to know. There's no actual feasible way to trace them. And then when people refuse to buy from Sierra Leone, they would just get shipped over borders with other bordering countries, and then they would be sold out of there. And you can, he walks you through it. You can see that like these countries that have no diamond mines are selling tons of money in diamonds. So like that's clearly they can't do that. So that means they're most likely kind of laundering them through to look like a clean source. Yeah, overall, I wasn't a huge fan of the book in terms of the tone, but I thought a lot, and in terms of some of the bold statements he made, but overall I found it informative. And that was really my dive into Sierra Leone. Okay, now we're going to go to the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the first book I read for this, which was the first book I read for this project, is Cobalt Red by Siddarth. This was a great book. He basically took the concept of what Greg Cambell did, but wrote a better book. Kind of took it to a better level, was much more empathetic to the experience of the people that he was interacting with and engaging with, and it was just a little bit more nuanced. But it was not about blood diamonds, it's about cobalt and the servitude people kind of exist in, and the desolation to these parts of the Congo to mine cobalt. And cobalt is hugely used in the world. Cobalt is used in batteries and rechargeable batteries specifically, so your life is run on cobalt. And he explains how, just like these blood diamonds, you cannot track the cobalt back to these suppliers. So he takes you through the whole process. He goes into the country, he goes to these mining locations, he interacts with locals, he gets to learn their stories, and he weaves these stories into the narrative. And they're very heartbreaking. Just like I would say the same sort of empathy that you get in in Fever, Feuds, and Diamonds, you see that same more empathetic perspective to the experiences people are facing in Cobalt Red. People, like, the dangerous conditions people work in, the fact that they make, like, basically no money for what they're doing, like pennies a day, like not pennies, like dollars a day. And it's not enough to survive on. It's not enough to sustain their families. And the huge amounts of hazards that are in these mines, the amount of people that die in mining accidents, the amount of mutilation that occurs in these mining accidents where people's legs get smashed. So it's like their life is saved, but at what cost? Because they're only working in these mines because they have to. And a lot of it is child labor, a lot of child labor, because they cannot afford to send their kids to school. And then they have to help work for the family by going to the mines. Women, it talks about women being very unsafe in these mining conditions, a lot of rape happening, and women, generally speaking, trying to group up together. He talks about just like the starvation conditions, the terrible water conditions, just the hugely horrible things that are going on. And then that he goes up the levels of like trying to follow this. So this is like the bottom of the food chain, the people mining, and then the cobalt gets sold to individuals. If I recall correctly, I'm trying not to mix up my books, but a lot of Chinese companies, so a lot of Chinese nationals living in the country, working for the Chinese government in these labor positions, well, not labor positions, but more like merchant positions, where they're buying the cobalt from people who are like independent miners, or I can't recall the term that they use, that makes it sound like fair trade when it absolutely isn't. And you try to follow the trail of like these eventually get to, major companies like Apple and Sony and stuff like that, and how it gets there, and the traceability is completely lost. But if you go to these corporations' websites, they claim that they're following ethical practices, but he watched the diamond or the cobalt be mixed between these like slave type conditions and the more official mining places where people have legitimate jobs and they get like paid a regular salary and they go to a mine. That all gets mixed onto the same trucks. So just like with the blood diamonds, you really don't have true ethically sourced cobalt. And I think that like blood diamond and cobalt red, both really like the root of them is the exploitive, extractivist capitalism that prevails and allows this to happen, and is the cause of this happening. And it's at the detriment to so many different societies. And these were just two focused areas. After reading Cobalt Red, it had the whole historic section where it kind of talked about the history of the DRC and how the DRC was stolen. The land was kind of stolen from people where they signed treaties, even though they couldn't read or write the language that they were giving away their land to King Leopold of Belgium. And he actually, I don't even want to say owned, but he claimed the land, and it was him personally that claimed it, not a claim through the Belgium. Like, it was his, and he actually never set foot there. But then it became, after his life, it became a Belgian colony. Why can't I think of the word? It became a Belgian colony, and I was reading that in Cobalt Red, and I was like, all right, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this part of the history. I feel like there's more to be learned there. And I read the Lumumba Plot, The Secret History of the CIA and a Cold War Assassination by Stuart A. Reid. This was also an enjoyable read for me. It's the subtitle I think is misleading. I think it's meant to attract an American audience to want to pick up the book, but the book is really much larger in scope, and it's about the Belgian colony, the striving for independence from the Belgian colony by the individuals of the DRC, and gaining that independence, and the struggle that kind of came in, and the eventual coups and the assassination of the first democratically elected prime minister of the DRC. But I think it goes a lot deeper than just the American involvement in this conflict. I would say the structure of the narrative itself is quite compelling. He introduces a lot of characters and individuals, real people, but they read like characters. They feel like real and fleshed out and full with ambitions and motivations. And I think that the way it's told is very straightforward, very commercial, and it kind of wants you to keep reading. I already knew how everything was going to eventually come out because I had read Cobalt Red, but even so, I was really engaged in the way that he unfolded the story. So it starts in the time before the independence in 1960 from Belgium, and how that independence was very quickly obtained. There wasn't much talk of the DRC and the individuals in the DRC claiming independence from Belgium until there were conferences with other African countries and their fight for independence. And so it kind of argues that it came on so fast that no one was really prepared for the transition. Belgium itself did not really help with that transition. And then once the transition started, the UN and the US really played a role in how everything kind of panned out. And one of the things they talk about is that the Belgium in the colony, the Belgian government did not let Native individuals interact with any jobs of importance. They weren't allowed to have the same education. And so when there was this white flight that happened right after independence, a lot of the relevant workers left, and it filled holes in the not just the structure of the government, but in fundamental needs of a group of people to continue to operate, especially when years and years of colonizing powers kind of took away cultural identity and cultural practices in some capacity. Then it kind of plays into the electing of the new government and Lumumba, the first prime minister, and how he came to power, and the other powers and the different indigenous groups that had cultural heritage with each other, and the issues that caused in developing the new government, because it was really lines, the DRC is lines on a map that don't mean anything to different tribal affiliations. So then there were different ideologies of becoming different states or maintaining one federal power. And then Lumumba pulls in the UN, and the interactions with the UN, and the UN coming in trying to step in, and then different people within the government trying to gain independence, and then corruption happening, and lawlessness on the streets, and the eventual kind of US involvement in terms of this being one of the CIA's first bids to host a coup in a different government, in the setting of, we don't want there to be communist entities in this state. I did find it interesting that the rationale that was conveyed in this book for why the US was so interested was like the Cold War era Soviet type situation. Because as I come to know, or I knew beforehand reading Cobalt Red, there's not just cobalt, but there's a lot of resources that the DRC has. And clear it seems like that's not what they were after, but you see where things have led, and that being the extractivism being very extreme, and neither, at least from the perspective of a Cobalt Red, neither the DRC nor the Soviet Union playing any sort of role in that extractivism, at least in that capacity of Cobalt. So I appreciated that the book itself really looked at the situation from an internal lens of like Lumumba and the other individuals in the government trying to build the government up, the conflict between all those people, and then it scoped it out to like a more global narrative and global perspective. And you saw the way that in the 60s African countries were being treated, and like the consistent racism that's happening through people's perspectives on African governments attempting to build themselves into democratic republics or other governmental structures that they may or may not agree with. Overall, a good read. I would say that my experience reading books about the DRC was better because I thought that the books were written a little bit better. Yeah, so those are the first 4 books that I have read for the nonfiction section. I have read a few other books for my Africa project, but I'm trying to break them up into videos that have like a more cohesive theme. So I have to read a few more books in kind of each section to make videos about them. But I will update you on my progress as we go. Just for the horizon, the next books that I plan on reading for nonfiction, I do plan on diving deeper into the DRC. So there is a book that I have that I'm pending from my library right now about King Leopold's interactions in the Congo and his colonization, that is called King Leopold's Ghost. So I will be reading that soon. I've also started How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. It is very academic and philosophic, so it's hard for me to read it in more than like very small bites, but it's one of those books that like it's easy to get lost in his narrative. So I need to figure out my plan of action for reading that because it's intense. It's an intense read. And yeah, if you have any other suggestions of books that I should read for this project, you can check out my TBR video essentially where I talk through my plans for this project, or you can leave them in the comments and I will definitely look into them. That is all I got for this video, so until next time, happy reading.